Hi AP, welcome to the one where I talk about data types in programming. Data types are something that are really important for us because everything in computing is handled a little bit differently based on its data type. What we need to understand is that the core of computing are these binary numbers called bits. A bit stands for binary digit, which is just a 1 or a 0. And everything you write on a computer eventually gets translated down to a series of bits. So whether you were writing in Scratch in middle school, or Python last year, or JavaScript this year, when the computer compiles and runs that code, it's actually translating it down what we call a chain or a hierarchy of abstraction, all the way down until it's put in binary and can be read by the hardware of your computer, which is kind of crazy and pretty cool. Because everything can be represented by this series of digits, we have to be really careful with what type of data we're giving the computer, because different types of data is read with a different series of binary digits. That's why it's so important that we understand the difference between these data types and when we might use some over the other. So different parts of our program, like different abstractions and functions, may also ask for different data types or types of data to run correctly. You can kind of think of how if statements always need a Boolean condition to check for in order to run, and ellipses in P5 require numbers that represent coordinates and sizes. If you try and write in an ellipse like top left, top right, and it's not a variable holding that data, the computer is going to get really mad and confused because it doesn't understand what you're talking about. Any of the data types that we are about to talk about can be stored in a variable or an array or another data structure to make it easier to call on them later. Variables, arrays, all those data structures, they are just made to hold any types of data. These are specific types of data that you would feed and put into them. Different programming languages will also recognize different data types differently, and this is just based on how the language was built. So you don't have to worry about this too much. I just think it's worth knowing for your future of different computer science. But lightly typed languages generally have very few data types, and the computer tends to be pretty forgiving about what data type you use. JavaScript is what we consider a lightly typed language, because there aren't a ton of data types it deals with, and if you try and put numbers and strings together, which we're going to talk more about in a minute, it will be super forgiving of you. Heavy typed languages have lots of data types beyond the basic ones that we are talking about today, and the computer gets mad when you try and merge those types together. So Swift is a heavier typed language. That's the the iOS programming language. It has lots of data types. It distinguishes between 32-bit numbers and numbers bigger than that, and just all kinds of different values that honestly make my head spin a little bit. But if you ever are going to work in those languages, those are things that you will become more comfortable and familiar with. The first of we're going to talk about 4 data types for JavaScript. And you can definitely get into the weeds about breaking these up more specifically, but these are kind of our big 4 for this class and for the scope of things that we will be doing. The first being strings, which you guys are really familiar with by now. Anytime that you are taking information from a pop-up prompt, that is always a response being returned as a string. And you guys know this because strings are anything between quotation marks. You can use single quotation marks, double quotation marks, or even these funny little thing called backticks, which are above your tab and to the left of your number one key. As long as you're consistent with what you use. So if you start with a double quotation mark, you should end with a double quotation mark. Strings aren't read for a numeric value. So if you say 22 in quotations, that's viewed as a word, even though we know that 22 is a number. The computer doesn't understand strings to be able to use greater than or less than, but it can definitely match strings using the double comparative equal sign. Numbers are what we would use to do math or to compare values, and numbers just are things with numeric values to our computer. The computer understands that these have a value, and it can use them to compare with other things using greater than, less than, or equal to, or even checking to see that they are the same. And being lightly typed, JavaScript doesn't care about specific types of numbers, but some languages do distinguish. So two big distinguishing numbers that you might see in other languages, or that those of you who have done Python have already seen, are integers, which are like all your whole numbers, 0 and negative numbers, and floats, which are decimal numbers. Float refers to a floating point value, the floating point being the decimal, and because these numbers have like kind of different place value, that's why the data can be stored differently. Again, JavaScript kind of abstracts some of that out for you, so you don't need to worry about mixing those two values, but if you ever code in other languages, that might come up. Booleans are another data type. It is any value that can only be true or false, and while we've seen in our computer science, the words true and false themselves are Booleans, so are any statement that would lead to a true or false response. So, for example, if you said 16 is less than 30, that's a Boolean because it's something that can either be true or false, and in this case, that is a true statement. Similarly, you can have Booleans that involve strings, so if you said mouse is the same as cat, that would also be a Boolean, but its value would be seen as false because those two things do not match. Our final data type is one that we're going to talk about a little more in future lessons and in future units, but there is a data type called objects, and objects are a data structure that are able to hold a lot of information at once. In their simplest form, they hold something called key-value pairs in a dictionary, which is like the most primitive version of an object you can get in JavaScript. And in past classes, you may have seen arrays, which are like our fancy computer science word for lists. And those are just a really specific type of object. It's a little weird, and you guys are welcome to head down this rabbit hole if you want, but in JavaScript, most things we deal with are objects, and we aren't going to get too much into the weeds on that one, but just understand that if you are ever doing like some internet research on your own, you are going to see people refer to most things in JavaScript like an object, even though we have more specific ways to type them. There is one last thing we should be aware of. We don't need to worry about this now. We will be practicing this later. But there is something in JavaScript called, in all programming languages, called casting and recasting. And this is essentially when you take a piece of data and you change its type in the program. For those of you who took Software 1 with Ms. Schumann, you guys probably did this a lot with Python, where you were changing things between strings and integers or floats. When we recast, we are just taking one thing and giving it a new type. So an easy example in JavaScript is this number function. It takes anything you pass as an argument and it turns it into a number. So if we said number 22, and 22 is a string, it's in quotes, it would return the value 22 as a data type of a number. We are going to use this a lot when we are using like inputs or prompts because those are automatically strings, and if we want a number that we can do math with, we need to make sure we turn that value into a number. So we will see this more later. Don't worry about it now. Just know in the back of your mind that it's there. Please use this to fill out your data type vocabulary sheet. Please rewatch if you missed anything, and then you guys are going to do a brief data scavenger hunt where you see how some of these data types look in the program. Good luck, guys!